invite our Honorable Chief Guest, Dr. Ravi Sinha. I invite Dr. Sinha sir to present our program.
Professor Ravi Sinha is a kind of theoretical physicist. I mean, very interestingly, for you all to know that he graduated his PhD from MIT, so one of the most prestigious institutes in the world. So he got his PhD from MIT, and then he worked at several places, including US. He worked as a professor at Physical Research Laboratories, Ahmedabad. He also worked at Gujarat University as a professor of physics. And despite all that his interest in physics, he sacrificed them to say for the kind of social activism he was involved with. And he resigned to his job and got into this new socialistic thought process and then new initiatives in the society. So he's well known for his book called Globalization of Capital. That was published in 1997. And he has delivered very popular lectures at many places. Various topics covering covering a range of topics, especially on the focusing on the capitalism, modernism, and cultures and etc. And recently, I mean, of late rather, he's very much involved with New Socialist Initiative. It's called New Socialist Initiative, and he's like the founder member of that, and he's taking care of organizing several seminars under the name of New Socialist Initiative. And very eminent speakers, historians, scholars, and many scholars have used that podium to come and speak in that New Socialist Initiative platform. And we're very glad that he wanted to spend some time with us, the Essence Group, who we thought that kind of science enthusiasts, what we call basically most of us are science enthusiasts. And of course, we are interested in the part of culture, history, and then society, and then also some of us are also like literature, poets, and etc. So the idea that we wanted to form a group to deliberate among ourselves and to carry this message to the society as much as possible.
2017 ఫేస్బుక్లో పరిచయం ఉన్న ఒక ఫ్రెండ్ జస్ట్ ఆయన గురించి వివరాలు కానీ ఆయన గురించి పర్సనల్ కానీ నాకు ఏమాత్రం తెలియకోకుండా కటికపూర్లోని ఒక ప్రోగ్రామ్ అటెండ్ అయినప్పుడు అక్కడ కలిసిన ఒక మిత్రుడు కంటే ఎక్కువ యాక్చువల్లీ మిత్రుడు అనేది చాలా చిన్నపడం గురించి కాదని చెప్పేసి మా ఇద్దరు అభిరుచులు కలిసి ఒక లీడర్స్ క్లబ్ లాగా ముఖ్యంగా భాగ్యశాల గురించి ఆయన చెప్పినప్పుడు తత్వశాస్త్రం గురించి తత్వశాస్త్రంలోని సారాంశం గురించి తెలుగులో అత్యంత సరళంగా తెలుగు భాషలో సామాన్య జనానికి కూడా తెలియాలి అనే ఉద్దేశంతో ఆయన రాసే రచనలు కానీ ఆయన చేసే ప్రసంగాలు కానీ మనకు చాలా ఉపయోగపడతాయండి. తెలుగులో మనకి సరైన పదజాలం లేదు, తత్వశాస్త్రాన్ని కానీ లేకపోతే మిగతాటిని కానీ చర్చించుకోవడానికి కానీ. నేను చెప్పేది అకాడమిక్ కాదు, సామాన్య ప్రజలు అంటే ఒక ఫేస్బుక్ గ్రూప్ లాగా చేయాలి అనే ఉద్దేశంతో విరించి నేను కలిసి ఒక తత్వశాస్త్ర సారాంశంగా మొదలైన ఈ గ్రూప్ అంటే ఒక లీడర్స్ గ్రూపు ఒక హాబీగా ప్రయాణమైన ప్రయాణం ఈరోజు ఒక 6 సంవత్సరాల తర్వాత ఒక పెద్ద గ్రూప్గా ఎదిగి కల్లూరు భాస్కరం లాంటి మేధావులు మొన్నే చంద్రబాబు భక్తులు గారు కాంగ్రెస్ గురించిన ఎన్లైట్మెంట్ అనే ఒక వ్యాసం గురించి మా గ్రూప్లో ప్రసంగించడం జరిగింది. మంచి వక్తలు, మంచి మేధావులైన వక్తల్ని ఆకర్షించి మంచి అంటే సీరియస్గా మొదలెట్టింది 6 సంవత్సరాల క్రితం మొదలైంది సరే, సీరియస్గా మొదలెట్టింది గత 2 సంవత్సరాల నుంచే. ఇది అనతికాలం అనుకోవచ్చు, నేను అనుకోవడం. ఈ అనతికాలంలోనే ఇంత ఇదిగా ఆన్లైనే కాకుండా ఆల్మోస్ట్ ప్రతి వారము కూడా జూమ్ మీటింగ్ జరుగుతుంది. విత్ ఇన్ ఎసెన్స్ లో ఉన్న గ్రూప్ మెంబర్స్ కానీ లేకపోతే బయట నుంచి పిలిపించిన వక్తులు ఎవరైతే ఆయా రంగాల్లో నిష్ణాతులు అనుకుంటారో వాళ్ళని పిలిపించిన ఇది కానీ ప్రతి వారం కూడా జూమ్ మీటింగ్ జరుగుతుంది. అలా ఆన్లైన్లో ముందుకు తీసుకెళ్తున్న ఈ ప్రోగ్రామ్ని ఈ రోజున ఆఫ్లైన్ తీసుకొచ్చి మన రవిసింహ గారి చేత మంచి టాపిక్ ఈ విధంగా ఈ రోజు మొదలెట్టడం అనేది చాలా మగావము, చాలా అభినందనీయం. దీనికి నేను విరించి గారిని, అది కేవలం విరించి గారి కృషిది, విరించి గారిని అభినందిస్తున్నాను. థ్యాంక్ యూ సార్.
Basic question: what is this Needham's question for the in the Indian context? Needham is a historian. Joseph Needham is a historian, a British historian. He worked basically on the Eastern history, especially Chinese. So what he has observed, by the 12th century, China was a bit forward in scientific development. To say any civilization, whether it is scientifically developed or not, there are certain things that has to be, like what modern historians think, like there are one or two points like it. One is having a paper and pen, like something to write, and having a gunpowder to attack any enemies, anything like that. And then next point, Diksuchi, yeah, compass. So with that, they can go to any locations. They can fix their fence and enemies like that. So these are the basic things which modern historians think these are the things for the civilization to prosper scientifically, or to say an advanced civilization. But by the 12th century, China was having all these things. So, but what happened to China by 15th or 16th century? Why that Renaissance or any like modern philosophical, modern scientific development not happened in China? Why it happened only in the Europe? So, by 12th century, China was a leading civilization with 33% of GDP, world GDP from China. So in such a situation, what happened to China suddenly? Why it has not shown that much of progress in the science? So that was a basic question called asked by the Needham, which we call Needham's grand question. So that question now we are asking in the same way that to the Indian context. So what happened to India? Because when we see after Mauryan and Gupta dynasties, there is a development of religion, culture, and arts, philosophies. And by the 7th century, we have a great philosopher Shankara, and Bauddha philosophies quarreling and lot of exchanges, dialogues, debates. So such a huge philosophical and scientific atmosphere, cultural atmosphere, rich cultural soil. But what happened to India? Because what Needham says, like India and China might have lost the opportunity to become themselves modern and scientific. So, to understand this, we need some insight. What happened in India, especially from 7th to 17th century, which we are saying like modern scientific development that happened in Europe. So, this 10 centuries, what happened in India, and how this today has that not happened. Still, we are seeing today, like if any Ganesha is some milk is there, then everybody will go and see what is happening there. And if any vibhuti is coming from Sai Baba's photo, everybody is going there. So, such a wonderful philosophical society, how it has collapsed to this much of religiosity and this much of irrationality. That is a big question one has to ask, all of us has to ask, what kind of India was there and how it is ruining itself and still it is going on. So unless or until we don't find the answer to this basic question, we cannot have any tool for us to work further. Because if you understand this, then at least some of us can work on what were the lackings, what were the loopholes, why can't we improvise this. So this was a basic idea of taking this question.
The topic may sound a bit intellectual or theoretical, but our concerns are very practical. And mostly our focus will be, as you will see, even though I may take a bit of time to make my argument, and I am trying to, in a hand-waving way, in a not very rigorous way, in a hand-waving way, I am making an argument about the nature of our society and civilization, as well as about the nature of science, and how they should interact today. And in that light, how do we visualize a desirable future, not only in the political domain, social domain today, but also at a civilizational scale. So in a way, the topic is such that we will have to take a very long view of history and a very long view of what kind of future we think will be desirable for our country and civilization. That large canvas is the problem why you will find the argument at times too theoretical maybe, or not too theoretical, I mean historical, intellectual and so on, somewhat removed from practical issues of the day. But I hope to still convey the sense in which it is very practically connected with the problems of our society. So, I must apologize in advance that if the argument takes some time and it sounds long-winded, it's because we are meeting for the first time, and I would like to give you a glimpse of some arguments that we are in the process of developing in the last several years. Let us see how the day goes, how we proceed with time. But I must warn you that there might be Needham, for example, the name was unfamiliar to me 2 years ago. Okay? So nobody should feel that the name is unfamiliar, or some of the concepts that will come in the course of our discussion. They may be new. Don't feel hesitant to stop me at any time and ask. But we have to bring many things together in order to make a large argument. So that is the context. So first, very basic, Dr. Frenchi already explained why did the scientific revolution leading to modern science and technology take off in Europe and not in China. Even as until 16th century, China had been far ahead of the West in development, in practical knowledge and innovation. And the same question can be asked, and in fact has been asked by many people, in the context of India too. Till 1780, India accounted for approximately 1/3 of the world production, and slightly ahead even of China. And I know economists are sitting here, I don't know how they calculate GDP from 2000 years back. I wouldn't know that, And there are controversies about that, whether those things, can be calculated or not. But we go by the standard experts, in the field. So they claim that India accounted for 1/3 of the world production till 1700, and China about 25 or 27%. And that had been more or less the case for 2 millennia. For 2000 years, these two societies were the leading producers in the world. Joseph Needham famously said that given that situation, how Galilean science could come to birth in Pisa. Pisa was Galileo's town. How Galilean science could come to birth in Pisa, but not in Peking or Patna. Joseph Needham, as you know, was born in 1900, died in 1995. He was a British biochemist and historian of science who became legendary sinologist, an expert in China. and expert on the history of science in China. His lifelong project on science and civilization in China has continued even after his passing away in 1995. And out of the 27 volumes that have come so far, I think science in China has been studied, thanks to Needham, in far greater detail than science in Europe itself. So 27 thick, fat volumes, and out of those, 15 Needham himself, got prepared. So a remarkable achievement. For example, as Dr. Virenki was pointing out, Needham once said that Francis Bacon, the famous philosopher and philosopher of science too in early 17th century England, Francis Bacon considered 4 inventions: gunpowder, magnetic compass, paper, and printing press, the keys that opened for the West the gates to the modern era. And all 4 were invented in China, much before the West came to know about these things. And along with China, India also was a glorious civilization. As I said, introduction is ahead of China. And also Arab Islamic world, which between 19th and 13th century was probably the intellectually and scientifically most advanced part of the planet, Arab Islamic world. And in fact, Greece, on which the West takes so much pride, and seeks its intellectual, philosophical heritage to that heritage of Greece was preserved by Arab Islamic world, and they had protected it, and then from Arabic, the Greek knowledge, whether of geometry or philosophy, was translated back into Latin, and became well known to Europeans, after Renaissance. So Renaissance, 14th, 15th, 16th century, when Europe woke up and saw that, we were great ones, the Greek period, that Renaissance was not so much a waking up of European by themselves. In fact, Arab world played a very important role in waking them up. Now, no matter what gets talked about today.
But they don't mention it much.
Why do they? So, well, there are critiques also of Needham's question. For example, it is often said that can the question be answered at all? Specifically from Copernicus to Newton. With Newton, as we will see a little later, with Newton, scientific revolution comes to maturation. So, it is basically Copernicus, Kepler, Galileo, Boyle, Newton. Those of you who don't know the names, we will discuss, in the breaks, and some of it will come in my presentation also. So basically, scientific revolution of 17th century in Europe, largely in Britain, France, and Germany. Germany did not exist at that time, but that age. So Nathan Sivan, one of the colleagues of Joseph Needham, a great admirer of Joseph Needham, still he was critical also of posing the question in this way. Did not happen question. Why did it happen is one side of the question. And wherever it did not happen is the other side of the question. So most of the criticism are of the did not happen part. That is difficult to explain. He, for example, said that it is striking that this question, why didn't Chinese beat Europeans to the scientific revolution, happens to be one of the few questions that people often ask in public places about why something didn't happen in history. It is analogous to the question of why your name did not appear on page 3 of today's newspaper. He's saying that it's just, you can't always ask the question why something is not happening. That's it. So but don't get me wrong.
There is answer, right? Why did not happen in India or China, right?
There is, we can make, that is why we should not rush to answers, because these are very large questions about very
We
large.
have an interactive section after let's out there.
We have these are large questions about very large civilizations over a very large period of history. So it is not that, we should, of course, all of us go by common sense, what makes sense, and we might feel like we have answers to all these questions, but we should question ourselves that whatever we feel are the answers, those are adequate answers or not. And that is the purpose of going deeply into the subject, into history, into facts of history, and so on. So we will see various sides of the complexity of the problem. In fact, you can see that when people say that why it did not happen in China or India, earlier, before people like Needham, before his generation, this question wasn't even asked, because till end of 19th century, till beginning of 20th century, it was taken for granted that science will arise only in Europe. Who else? Only Europe could come up with science. They are the only ones who were capable of doing that, and they were, maybe some people even will say that not only racially, genetically ahead of rest of humanity. And also, what question you are going to ask about other civilizations? Only they could have the answer. So the standard explanation of scientific revolution, of advent, emergence, origins of modern science was racist. It said that, Caucasians, the white race, was ahead of others in social evolution, and scientific evolution was a proof of that. Colonialism, why did they come to rule over us? Because we needed to be civilized, and they had the right to civilize us because they had science and development and philosophy and everything else. Eurocentrism, scientific revolution could have happened only in Europe, because Europe, they were the descendants of Greeks, the great Greeks, and then they had the sequence from 14th century to 18th, 19th century. They had the sequence of Renaissance, Italian, mostly in Italy and Spain and so on. Reformation, the split of Christianity into two parts, Catholics and Protestants, and all the political as well as philosophical developments that occurred, in the aftermath of Reformation and Enlightenment. 18th century, for example, especially France, where all the philosophers, the French intellectuals, arose, and sort of provided the theoretical foundation on which later on French Revolution could have. So Enlightenment. So they had it. Who else could have that? And then also the Orientalism, the ideologues of colonialism, who came to rule over much of the third world, they were not, of course, the West is West and East. This is the point, maybe early 20th century. But the idea is older. They thought that East and West is fundamentally different. So it is West is superior. Scientific revolution is expected only there. And that then results in their ruling over us or their civilizations. So arrival of Marxist movement as well as Marxist theorization and the anti-colonial movement, that changed the atmosphere. before that, intellectual atmosphere was Eurocentric, or emphasizing that it was obvious that science will happen in Europe. That atmosphere in 20th century changed. That too changed in Europe itself. I mean, most of these names that we come across, they were all from Europe. But we are not so much into us and them as we are going to focus on the ideas. So this Eurocentric, in many ways racist ideas were challenged by Europeans themselves, those Europeans who were Marxists and those who stood with the anti-colonial movement, who stood against their own governments, supporting those people who were being ruled by their governments. So we have to recognize that as one of those people we will talk about. With his question we will talk about. And Needham's, what he says, ecumenical, he's meant it in a different way, but ecumenical means actually ecumenical word arises from where all parts of humanity, wherever humanity lives. But he meant is intercultural, as well as a kind of conception of science that has human values behind it. So all that is covered in that word ecumenical. He talked about the different origin of science. And so universalism and humanism of science, that was underlined, that was emphasized by this generation that I am talking about. And I just have a quote from an article by, from a conference on Needham's question. The ultimate aim of Needham's monumental project Science and Civilization in China was to promote mutual understanding among different cultures. The term to things Chinese came in 1936 when he was an active member of the movement of natural scientists against fascism and for a socially responsibilist stance in research. As such, he is usually counted as one of the inner groups of Bernalists. Bernalist is J.D. Berner, famous scientist and historian of science, philosopher of science. Personal friendship with three young Chinese scientists, these three names, who came to work in Cambridge laboratories at that time, was an important catalytic factor. As he used to say about these three younger Chinese colleagues, he used to say, the fact that as scientific minds, they were so much like my own, raised vividly in my consciousness the historical problem of why modern science had originated in Europe alone and not in China and in India. So we are still basically producing his question. I shouldn't take too much time in the introduction itself. I usually do that, but we have, the day with us, so I will maybe encroach upon your time a little bit if I get delayed. So Needham's focus was in China, but the issue was not about China alone. The issue was much more general, and that is why we are discussing it here today. So Needham's philosophical and historical approach to science, the main point about science itself is that he considered science as a cultural universe. And we will talk about that a lot more. Which means that at the core, science transcends, goes beyond all the cultural boundaries. Okay? Secondly, it is a collective and related. It is a collective product of entire humanity. He used to use this phrase, all rivers run into the sea. So science has not arisen just uniquely only in scientific revolution. Many streams of science arose in many cultures, and then they came together to give rise to the situation in which modern science, it took the shape of modern science, the scientific revolution. thirdly, the ethical values and standards, what was called responsibilism for science and scientists, science and society relationship. For this, Bernal J.P.S. Harden, who was very much interested in India, and Needham, interested in China, they were the examples. And then also he underlined the fact, and we will come to this a little bit more a little later, that the historiography of science, how to write history of science. Basically, you can have two approaches or a mixture of two approaches. One is called externalist, that science, the origin of science was determined by factors external to science. So political history, economic history, society, culture, in a larger sense. All that help science go one way or the other, arise in one place and not arise in another place. So this is the externalist explanation of origin of science, as opposed to the internalist explanation, which means that science and scientific thought and scientific method has its own internal structure. And where those internal structure, the internal components of scientific thought, how and where did it come together, and why and where it failed to come together, that will be something like internalist history of science. And of course the reality is a combination of both, because most of the time when we are going to talk about history today, we will not talk of history at the level of a decade or even of a century. We will talk of history at the civilizational level, which is several centuries or maybe millennia. Okay, so it's in that a combination of externalist as well as internalist explanation will be needed. The question is in what combination. And Needham, who was himself an accomplished scientist, embryologist, he wrote a famous book, in early 1930s, when he was very young. Very accomplished scientist himself. He practically became a historian of science, okay? And better known for being historian of science. So his emphasis shifted from the internalist explanation to externalist explanation. How other factors of society play a role in the development of science. So that made the comparative history of science, and comparison of different civilizations a possibility. He brought this together. That if you want to explain science only through internalist method, then you will be forced to be Eurocentric. Okay? Because that is where the scientific revolution happened. But you have to, if you want to address larger question of why it happened there and why it did not happen elsewhere, and what should those people where it did not happen, what attitude they should have towards science. That is the question for us. In the end, we will come to that. What attitude to take about science ourselves, who missed out on otherwise probably we would have been the colonizers and they would have been colonized, but we missed out. So, being a colonizer is no great thing, but don't get me wrong, but I'm just saying, it that way. So the comparative history of civilizations, that becomes possible when you have externalist factor come into the explanation. So universal core of science, the cultural universal, that is needed. If there is nothing universal about science, then what could we compare? They will have their science and we will have our science. But science is not like that. It's not their science versus our science. So knowledge is a broader category, and some people can have their traditional knowledge, and we can have our traditional knowledge, but the same thing cannot be applied blindly to science. Science becomes a different category. Okay? So the universal core of science makes it possible to compare civilizations, at least in this narrow context, in the context of scientific evolution. And that comes through, as I said, externalist factor interacting with internalist factor. And then Europe can be studied vis-a-vis other civilizations. Not only other civilizations can be studied vis-a-vis Europe, Europe can be studied vis-a-vis other civilizations too. And uniqueness of Europe in having the scientific revolution, that itself may be historical. So we can go into that. So everything becomes historical. We can analyze Europe as it happened there, as well as our own civilization. Why did it not happen, and what can be done about that now? So comparative study becomes possible in order to have what the point I'm making is the following, and it is an important point, keep in mind, that this comparative study becomes possible is dependent on a certain idea about science. If you have two relativist idea of science, a relativist means I think that they will have their science, we will have our science. Each culture will have its own science. If you have that kind of idea, then the comparative civilizational study will not be possible.